We usually start with our mission. The mission of the Peel Center is to educate and empower families to ensure that children, youth, and young adults with disabilities and special health care needs lead rich, active lives as full members of their schools and communities. Our objectives today will be that participants will become familiar with the Office of Special Education Programs Guidance on Discipline and Behavior. We'll be able to define terms such as exclusionary practices and informal removal, and learn practices that ensure students with IEPs have safe and supportive learning environments. So let's start. You can put your answer in the chat. Do students with IEPs have protections regarding discipline in schools? Yes? No? All right. No, every child is expected to follow the code of student conduct for the district. And you can usually find that on the district's website, find that code of student conduct. There aren't necessarily protections for students. There's things that the school has to do in certain circumstances, but no protections. Our students with disabilities are expected to follow the code of student conduct and can expect consequences and discipline for the actions. There are guidelines that can, again, help students with IEPs when the families and the districts are aware of them. But even in situations where a student might not have an IEP, but the child is thought to be in need of an IEP or of special education, then there are some considerations regarding that. So we got this guidance from the Office of Special Education in the 22-23 school year. Usually how I find it is I'll Google it. I think we have some links for you to show you where you can get it. Right now, where I usually find it in Pennsylvania is in the Patton website. And why it's limited to the alternative education for disruptive youth part of Patton, I'm not sure, because this benefits any student who has an IEP. But that's where you can find it. And the reason that OSEP, Office of Special Education Programs, issued this was the ongoing inequities in how discipline in school is addressed, mostly with our students with disabilities, Black students, boys and girls, sometimes girls more than boys. And the fact that schools were using exclusionary practices that are disproportionately used with students with disabilities, and like we said, especially students of color. And exclusionary practices are going to be practices where a child does not have access to instruction. So this is suspension and expulsion, and notably restraint and seclusion. So how does this guidance help? Well, it was created to reduce the use of these exclusionary disciplinary practices, one, by letting families know what schools should be doing, what the responsibility and obligations of the schools are, giving families knowledge and information about how they can seek these supports for their child. And the fact that research demonstrates that the use of these practices, these exclusionary practices, negatively impacts student outcomes and life trajectories. You might hear us talk about the school to prison pipeline. This is where it begins. These exclusionary practices, no support for the student as they're in school, or little support that doesn't help the student. So I think this video from the Special Education and Rehab Services, OSERS, it's a federal agency, is helpful in describing where this need came from and real statistics and numbers about the reason that this information was released.
Hi, I'm Megan Whitaker. I'm a special assistant in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the Department of
Megan.
Hi, I'm Megan Whitaker. I'm a special assistant in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the Department of Education. As Valerie mentioned, the last few years have been particularly challenging for children, families, and schools. The pandemic has brought with it shortages in personnel. It has impacted the health and well-being of children and families, and it has impacted the services that children with disabilities have received. Yet our obligations to children with disabilities remain. We are still called to fully implement IDEA and to meet the requirements laid out in it. As you know, IDEA requires that every child with a disability have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. For too long, we have held low expectations for children with disabilities, and we have failed to ensure that every child with a disability receives evidence-based instruction. Though we've made considerable progress since the passage of IDEA more than 40 years ago, due in large part to the unwavering commitment of families and the dedication of educators like you, we know that much work remains to ensure high-quality implementation of the law across the country for every child. When we don't consistently and appropriately meet the needs of children with disabilities, academic, social, emotional, behavioral, or mental health needs, we can begin to see symptoms of that failure. In this case, we have seen disparities in the use of discipline for children with disabilities, and it is a symptom of a system that is not yet meeting the needs of all children. For years, both IDEA Section 618 data and the Civil Rights Data Collection have demonstrated that many children with disabilities, particularly Black children with disabilities, were subjected to disproportionately high rates of disciplinary removals. There are pervasive disparities in the use of aversive practices such as restraint and seclusion, and in student disciplinary practices such as suspensions and expulsions in K-12 schools and in early childhood settings for children with disabilities. The most recent data we have from these federal collections show that even though preschool students served under IDEA accounted for less than 1/4 of total preschool enrollment, they made up more than half of preschool students who were expelled. School-age children with disabilities served under IDEA represented 13.2% of total student enrollment, but received 20.5% of one or more in-school suspensions and 24.5% of one or more out-of-school suspensions. Students with disabilities served under IDEA made up 80.2% of the students subjected to physical restraint and 77% of students subjected to seclusion, despite making up only 13% of students enrolled in public schools. Black children with disabilities made up 17% of children with disabilities between ages 3 and 21 under IDEA, yet accounted for 43.5% of all children with disabilities 3 to 21 served under IDEA who were suspended out of school or expelled for more than 10 days. The research is clear. The use of exclusionary disciplinary practices places large numbers of children with disabilities at risk for short and long-term negative outcomes, including lower achievement and increased likelihood of not graduating. It is time for us to break this cycle of reliance on exclusionary discipline. It is important to be crystal clear. IDEA does not preclude a local education agency from disciplining a child with a disability for violating a school's code of conduct, nor does it prevent them from taking appropriate action in the case of an emergency. Schools need not choose between keeping their school community, including students and school staff, safe and complying with the law. What we are asking for is for SEAs and LEAs to redouble their efforts to fulfill their obligations under IDEA. We urge them to look at their data, and examine their policies, practices, and procedures that are in place and may be contributing to these discipline disparities. We are also encouraging SEAs and LEAs to adopt evidence-based, proactive, and positive approaches to supporting students in addressing behavior. This includes identifying ways to better prepare and develop educators, including administrators, teachers, and service providers, to implement these preventative and responsive practices in place of exclusionary discipline, and to use evidence-based strategies to ensure students with disabilities receive FAPE. In turn, these practices can help reduce the number of children with disabilities subjected to exclusionary discipline. This guidance package comes in two parts and is designed to first answer questions you may have about the provisions of IDEA that relate to behavior and discipline. And second, to provide a resource to help SEAs and LEAs get started if they are not already investing in and implementing positive, proactive approaches. OSEP is committed to working with states and LEAs to protect the rights of and improve outcomes for children with disabilities. And we recognize and appreciate how hard school administrators, teachers, and educational staff across the nation work every single day to provide a safe, positive education environment for all. We hope this guidance package can prompt meaningful action to improve IDEA implementation for every child and improve how schools and early childhood programs support and respond to the educational needs of children with disabilities. And we hope it begins to shift how schools address behavior that prevents access to appropriate instruction. Together, we can ensure children with disabilities are no longer subject to avoidable and unnecessary discipline.
Let me get out of here. I'm getting there. Give me 1 minute here. And we're back. Possibly. Okay. So what are the key points here? Schools have to promptly evaluate a student whenever a disability is suspected. So earlier when I mentioned students who may be thought to be in need of special education, the schools should take initiative under Child Find in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to evaluate a child who may be in need of special education services. Parents can also make a request for evaluation and keep that documented, and there's timelines that the school has to follow to have that done. Now, a lot of this or all of this guidance from OSEP falls under Section 504 to encourage that there's no discrimination that's occurring and to make sure that children are served and provided a free, appropriate public education. So a student's Section 504 team determines the student's placements, which must include specification of behavioral supports. And this is explained in the guidance. I did want to bring up too that in the video, Megan referred to SEA and LEA. For folks who don't know, SEA refers to the state education agency in Pennsylvania. That's the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And the LEA is the local education agency, and that refers to your school district or school in terms of charters. So here's where we see the definition for informal removal. You know, those times when a school might call a parent and say, you know what, Johnny's just not having a good day today. Maybe you could come and pick him up and he can just take a little rest and then come back to school all refreshed tomorrow. Um, it sounds friendly. It sounds like, you know, we care about what's happening to the student, but in fact, it's exclusionary. He's missing instructional time. And let's call informal removal what it is. It's a suspension. When a child is not receiving their instruction for the day and a request has been made by the district, that's suspension. But what happens is the schools aren't following their own policy regarding suspension when they do this. I'm not saying all districts do this. I'm saying that when it happens, because we know we've had instances of where this has happened, the child's being denied their education. And if the school is going to tell the student that, you know, or tell the family, come pick them up for the day, and this the student does leave the school, then the school has to follow what they say they do in terms of suspension. And if that's send home a letter, record it on in their files, then that's what it is. So to go on with the definition here, an action taken by school personnel in response to a child's behavior that excludes the child for part or all of the school day, or even an indefinite period of time. These exclusions are considered informal because the school removes the child with a disability from class or school without invoking IDEA's disciplinary procedure. And this PowerPoint will be shared, so you'll have all of this information. So what's key takeaway number 2 of this guidance that was issued? Schools must evaluate a student with a disability to determine if the behavior is based on disability before imposing disciplinary actions, such as expulsions, a suspension over 10 days in a row, or a suspension for less than 10 days if there's a pattern of disciplinary removals totaling more than 10 school days in the school year. So when families call the appeal center, you know, and they'll talk about the fact that, you know, it's a 3-day suspension here or a 4-day suspension here. So it might not add up to 10, but there's this pattern that's developing. We've suggested the parents a few times, take a calendar, and for kids where this is happening, go ahead and, you know, use a highlighter or something for the days that the child has been, when the parents have been requested to come pick up the child, and go ahead and color those in on the calendar. You can see that there's a pattern that occurs where this is the type of discipline that's being used over and over again, and this affects their education. So then we go to determining if a student's disability has caused the incident that we're speaking about, whatever it is. Manifestation determination happens when there's an instance of that requires discipline. Again, look in your code of student conduct, and the IEP team or the 504 team tries to identify if the action was a manifestation of the disability. So there's information that we can get to you from the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, patent on manifestation determination, a worksheet that teams can work through. Basically, they're answering 2 questions. Was the behavior caused by or have a direct or substantial relationship to the child's disability? And was the behavior the direct result of the school's failure to implement the child's IEP? Now, I don't want families thinking that they have no input here. They absolutely have input. And the role of the family to be prepared for going to a manifestation determination meeting is to be able to explain to the rest of the team, what the disability oftentimes, how it manifests itself in these actions. So you have a child with ADHD who may not consider consequences. They act and they don't understand or don't think through what the consequences of their actions are going to be. That's something that, we would look at the IEP team to consider in a manifestation determination. So the third takeaway, we talk about actions recognized as discrimination. And this is where we fall under Section 504. And 504 was really what supported this guidance in ensuring that kids were getting the support that they needed for behavior. So failing to make reasonable modifications. Again, we talk about a child with ADHD, a high incident disability in school. This child is consistently removed from their learning activities for interacting with the student next to him. So we have to consider what would be a reasonable accommodation for this student. Now, it certainly isn't to have him leave the classroom, but reasonably think about what the school can do, what the IEP team or 504 team can put into those documents to ensure that the child's supported in that environment. And here we go back again to 504 and discrimination. Describing different treatment. For example, a student with autism support or autism spectrum disorder is disciplined more often and more harshly based on their disability. And I can tell you from personal experience that, oftentimes what will happen is a student with autism might react to something or might do something that any other student's going to do, but oftentimes because there's like a microscope on our kids, they're being watched, they're being looked at as if they're always anticipating that our kids are going to do something that is inappropriate or is a behavior of concern. And in this way, oftentimes, kids who don't have a disability will be able to get away with stuff, and kids with autism or a disability might be disciplined, whereas another child isn't. Discriminatory effects. Example here, a student with Tourette syndrome is constantly suspended based on school policy on profanity, which we know in some instances, Tourette syndrome is going to manifest itself with a child using curse words. If this is part of the disability, we have to think of appropriate supports to put into place so that the student's not suspended. So some questions that arise, and again, I would really encourage reading that question and answer from the guidance on discipline and behavior, just because I think so many of us with kids or educators see these instances happening in the schools and can really relate to the question and answers that you'll see in that document. So are schools required to support the behavioral needs of children with disabilities? Yes, they are. An evaluation with a variety of assessment tools and strategies to obtain a full picture of strengths and needs. This is why we, really focus on a multidisciplinary evaluation, see the child as all of the needs that they have, and come up with, what the needs are. The plan must be developed with measurable goals and revised as needed based on progress monitoring. So often I find that parents, they get progress reports, but not sure how to read them or what what's behind the meaning or what the progress monitoring is showing us. So we have another training on that, and I'm sure that'll be coming up at some point. But really understanding, or when you don't understand progress monitoring or progress reports, call the PO Center, call an advocate, someone who can help you with understanding progress monitoring. And an IEP must be accessible by all teachers and providers, substitute teachers included, so that they can provide all of the supports in that IEP. Um, I found a lot of times that I would actually share the IEP document with the teachers to ensure that they had that access. They didn't always have a copy of it. What the law says is that they have access to it. So keep those things in mind. What steps should the IEP team take to support the needs of a child with a disability whose behaviors impede the learning of a child and or other children? So we look to the IEP team. They have to develop or revise an IEP to provide individualized behavior supports to make sure the student can access their free appropriate public education in their least restrictive environment. For most kids, this is going to be in the class with typical peers through the intentional use of interventions and practices grounded in current evidence. That's why as Megan mentioned in the video, there is a companion document that has proactive strategies for schools to use to ensure that kids can remain in their classroom and have the behavior supports that they need to not impede the learning of themselves or others. So, I can sit here working from home today and telling these things in practice. This is going to take some doing. Nobody said it's easy, but I can tell you again from experience that finding what works and ensuring that the child has supports is worth it. So often we forget that behavior is communication. And for kids who don't have the language or communication skills to be able to say, this work is really frustrating, I can't take it, I'm just going to shut down. They act out. And we often say this, sometimes we don't remind ourselves, but sometimes in the moment it's hard to remember too. I'm going to be upfront with you and tell you, this is not in my wheelhouse, behavior and neuroscience. But it is something to consider when you think about what the needs of our kids are and how it's manifested in the school. So we all have brains that have evolved to understand how to be safe. The higher order learning happens depending on what's happening with our brain. If we're responding to real or perceived stress, our stress response kicks in and high order brain activity dims down. We go into what we call that fight, flight, or freeze. So either you're going to have a behavior, you're going to try and escape, or you're just going to shut down. And so often for kids with disabilities, and especially neurodivergent kids, this is what we see. So the stress or the anxiety impacts the learning and development for children. And oftentimes when that freeze kicks in, it's going to be perceived as non-compliance. So you think about in the classroom, what happens when we threaten someone? And is the child really learning when we use behavior interventions that aren't evidence-based and aren't something that the child's going to understand? So before we can make sense of what drives behavior, we have to understand what serves to keep us regulated. And often we think about or hear talk about dysregulation, children not being regulated, and not being able to regulate in the classroom. So it's all based on our unique set of experiences. And once we understand our own library of sensory, we can work on successful replacement behaviors. And oftentimes that does take some extra work for kids where language and communication is a deficit for them. So seeking replacement behaviors is sometimes challenging. I might suggest at this point, take a look at videos by Shelley Moore, Shelley, last name Moore, Moore. Shelley describes this in such a fantastic way and has a great storyteller too. So I'd look at the Shelley Moore videos to see what we're talking about here. So executive functioning is not something we're necessarily born with, but it develops as we grow, which only happens when the brain is regulated. So you're talking about kids who may have dysregulation, and this is really difficult. So they need specific support to access that regulation. And this is all, again, going to come through when we see these evaluations that are done, multidisciplinary education evaluations, where we can get a better idea of what supports are going to help an individual student. So how do differences in how students engage socially impact their access to regulation? All considerations here of coming up with those appropriate behavior supports. How do they communicate what they're doing? How do they let others know what they need? All considerations. Now, punishment, when we talk about discipline, punishment is when there's a negative consequence that comes with discipline, but doesn't necessarily teach a student. It's more of a reaction to a problem, but doesn't prevent it. And sometimes even, in school, we see these punishments that are occurring often too long after an incident has occurred that the child can't connect the two. It doesn't make sense to them. And it excludes rather than includes students with disabilities. And again, we're talking about these exclusionary practices. So we want to, do away with those and implement the things that will work long term. It activates that fight, flight, or freeze response. And they're not necessarily going to act the way you're expecting them to act. Results in long-term shame and heightened distrust. And again, starts that spiral of, maybe increased behaviors. As Megan mentioned in the video, impacts students of color disproportionately, which this is fact. I mean, we have facts that show that the disproportionality of students of color being affected by these exclusionary practices. And it's easier for the adults to take these actions. It's adult oriented. It's easier to tell the student, go down to the nurse or go down to the principal's office, than it is to address the needs of the student in the classroom, which is why we have to have those supports built in so that the teacher can do it, or, support that's in the classroom can help the student in the classroom where it's occurring. And over time, these things don't work anyways. And here's research to back that. So responsive discipline is what we're looking for. This builds a student's capacity to stay regulated and ready to learn. And, in school, we're all there to learn these days more than reading and writing and arithmetic. These are things that the student's learning to take them into being successful adults, having and maintaining a job. These are things they're learning. We go to school to learn. And this is where this has to occur. It sets the stage for students to learn from their mistakes and what they can do instead. It's inclusionary, it's restorative, and it's proactive. And that, again, we go back to the additional document that we have from sorry, I'm working from home. The pup's going to start barking. We go to the proactive strategies that are going to help schools support the student. Adults and students practice accountability together, establishing codes of conduct and community agreements. That helps for all students. And it's student-oriented, not adult-oriented. Again, research shows this. So I told you in the beginning, we were going to talk about what are some strategies to have in place that are going to help with the behavior supports. And districts should be familiar with these, and they're evidence-based, which is what we look for. This is what works to make sure that students with IEPs have safe, supportive, and predictable learning environments, and that it's free from discrimination. I want to make sure that we have time for question and answer. So there are some links that will show you what we be talking about here. Multi-tiered systems of support, PBIS support. This is what we're looking at here. This is multi-tiered systems of support. If you kind of think of a triangle, and at the bottom, you divide that triangle into 3 pieces. At the very bottom, you have supports for all students, whatever that might be. In the middle tier, we're talking about supports that may be occurring for less than the universal number of students, but to a smaller group of students. And at the top tier, this might even be individualized, or this is the tier where we're thinking about maybe the student does need an IEP or a 504 to provide these supports. Universal design for learning. This is when a teacher in a classroom uses universal design for learning to be able to teach on a spectrum of student needs. And from a student who has very few needs, maybe no support needs at all in the classroom, to students who have complex support needs in the classroom. And that teacher has the ability or has designed the class to address all the needs for all the students in the classroom. Universal design for learning, and this is through CAST, cast.org, CAST.org. Talks all about universal design for learning. Trauma-informed educational practices, and this is rather recent. We have only that information has come down to the schools maybe in the past 5 to 8 years, where we're learning that trauma really affects the way a student learns or affects their ability to learn in the classroom. So having more folks in the school who have trauma-informed or are aware of trauma-informed educational practices can ensure that they're providing the students with the support that they need. And access to communication. Students who do not have access to communication or communication that works for them as an individual student, often, like as we stated before, behavior is communication. So if they don't have access to communication, imagine the frustration. And we will see that behaviors will increase. So this is something that we can do to support the student, figure out what do they need, what is going to improve their ability to communicate so that there is less negative behavior occurring. So what if the IEP does not include positive behavioral interventions and supports and other effective strategies to address those behaviors? Well, now again, we're looking to the school to initiate often, but if the parent has to do the initiation, feel free to call the appeal center. We have a template you can use, or just send an email that says, you have these concerns and that you need the IEP team to get together to address these needs. And again, this documentation, this guidance that we've received from OSEP, share that with your school. And this is, one way to express to the IEP team that your child has a need that's not being met. Identify and collect types of data that will be needed to determine to revise the plan and address behavior more effectively with parent input and consent. So we have this IEP team that has unique partners. One partner has the educational expertise. They know it's out there. Hopefully, if they don't, they have some resources like Patton and the intermediate unit, and they have that educational expertise. Then we have the parent who is the expert, who has that expertise on the individual child. What works for this child? What doesn't work for this child? Where do we see these behaviors occurring at home? Where does the child often show these behaviors? Coming together, those two entities, those two pieces of this IEP team can come up with what's effective for the child and what will work at school. Failure to do this can result in denial of least restrictive environment and noncompliance with the IDEA. Just because a child has behaviors or behaviors that we're familiar with doesn't mean they can't be in their least restrictive environment. We have to use these proactive strategies to come up with ways to support them in the gen ed classroom. So here's some useful discipline resources. Both of these from the Education Law Center here in Pennsylvania, Back to School Guide, but really, I mean, that's what it's called, but this is information we can use at any time. Back to School Guide for students, families, and advocates. And a suspension and expulsion toolkit gives you information. Oh, well, Heather, looks like we have to do something about this.
Yeah, I guess we'll find another one.
Yeah, we have a broken link, so we'll have to, we'll get that to you. Again, we'll have a follow-up email from Heather that'll give you all the information that we're sharing here. This is our evaluation. We need that to get information from you about how can we make this training better, what information might not have been included that you needed, and how is this going to help you. So just take your phone, if you have your phone with you, scan the QR code. If not, there's a link down at the bottom there so that you can share an evaluation with us. I'm going to stop sharing here. Wait, let me see if there's, here are resources. Again, this is going to come to you. The Dear Colleague letter often comes from the feds to let you know why this information is being shared, what was the impetus for this information that they're sharing. Fact sheets, short, one-page fact sheets about the information that they're wanting to provide. And in this case, again, we're talking about discipline and behavior. And again, our evaluation. So I'm going to